This weekend is finally the weekend. After a long, long summer, walking and working through an Old Testament book, the book of Deuteronomy, we have finally landed at the last weekend of our summer-long series on this book. And just in case you have not been here, or this is your first time here, or maybe you were here, but then you were gone for a long time and we forgot, or you forgot what we were talking about, let me just begin by giving you a little bit of background on this book. The book of Deuteronomy, traditionally written by a guy named Moses. And Moses was a man who famously led the children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt across a wilderness to the promised land. And as the book of Deuteronomy opens, the Israelites, they are standing right there on the precipice of the promised land. They are ready and waiting to go into the promised land. And in a lot of ways, the book of Deuteronomy represents Moses' last stand. Because Moses is getting long in the tooth. He is getting ready to pass away. And so before he passes away, he has some things he wants the Israelites to know. And so the book of Deuteronomy are kind of the last words of Moses. He talks to them about everything from how to learn from your past mistakes, leverage those for the future, to how to manage bounty, what to do with what it is that God has given to you. And now this weekend, as we get to the end of this book and the end of this series, we're going to be in Deuteronomy 34, where Moses actually does pass away. Moses dies. But here's what I want you to know as we take a look at this story and at this chapter. This story in this chapter is not just a story about Moses' death. This story in this chapter is actually a story about something that is much bigger than that. This story in this chapter is a story about Moses' legacy. Because Moses left a long legacy across history. 3,400 years later, because that's how long ago Moses died. 3,400 years later, we're still talking about Moses. That's an incredible legacy. Now here's the thing, I bet that you might love to leave a legacy kind of like that. In fact, I bet that you might settle for a legacy that's less than that. Nobody needs to remember you for 3,400 years, but maybe just like a few years after you're gone, right? This is something we all want to do. This is something we all want to leave. We all want to leave a legacy. That's why people put together like last wills and testaments, right? They make sure that everything is arranged before they go to the grave. That way their family members don't take each other to court and fight over this and that and the other. They don't want to leave a legacy of fighting. They want to leave a legacy of peace and good memories. This is why every single night before my kids go to bed, I pray with them and I pray over them, and I pray the same prayer every single night. I pray that my kids would grow up knowing and loving and trusting in Jesus. Why do I pray that? Because I want to leave a legacy. I want to leave a legacy of faith. This is something that's almost endemic to human nature. We all want to leave a legacy. And so today, we're going to talk about how to do that. In fact, today, I just got two very simple things for you, okay? I want to talk to you about one thing that Moses did that you can do to leave a legacy. And then I want to ask one question, a question that I think we all need to ask about our own legacies. And so let's just start with the one thing that Moses did that you can do to leave a legacy. And here's what Moses did. Moses was fiercely focused throughout his whole life. Moses was fiercely focused on a goal. So, as Deuteronomy 34 opens, Moses, he decides to go for a little hike up a mountain. This is Deuteronomy 34, verse 1. Moses climbed Mount Nebo, and just to kind of situate you here, Mount Nebo is a mountain that is east of the Promised Land. And when Moses gets to the summit of this mountain, he has what I like to call a panoramic perspective on the promised paradise, okay? Say that 5 times fast. A panoramic perspective on the promised paradise. God shows up on the top of this mountain, and the Lord shows him the whole promised land. From Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. Just so you know, this panoramic perspective that Moses gets represents over 10,000 square miles. Moses is able to see a lot. This land is huge, and this land has also been a real long time coming. Because this land was first promised by God to a man named Abraham 680 years before Deuteronomy 34, before Moses and the nation of Israel finally gets there. It took the nation of Israel, after they left their slavery in Egypt, 40 years to get across the wilderness to the precipice of this promised land. This land has been a long time coming. You know, one of the things that my family and I do every summer is we go for a little beach trip down to the Texas Gulf Coast, Port Aransas. Now, between our home and Port Aransas, it takes us about 3 hours to get there. But maybe you remember this if you've had kids or you have kids. 3 hours for little kids can feel like 40 years. Have you ever noticed that? And so you load everything into the car, you pack up all the beach toys, right, and the life vests and all the food that you need and all the clothes that you need, and then finally the last thing you put in the car is the kids, and you pull out of the driveway, and it's amazing the questions they ask on a drive that's 3 hours. In fact, you may remember one question in particular that kids ask when they get a little anxious. What do they always ask? They say, are we there yet? And it's amazing how fast this question comes up when we're driving down to the Gulf Coast. About 10 minutes after we pull out of the driveway, it's usually the first time I hear, are we there yet? And I got to say, no. We still got 2 hours and 50 minutes left to go. 10 more minutes pass, and what do we get again? Are we there yet? And I got to say, no. We still got 2 hours and 40 minutes left to go. Now, let me ask you a question about that question. The question that kids always ask, are we there yet? Why do they ask that question so much? It's because they're fiercely focused on a goal. And the goal has nothing to do with packing. The goal has nothing to do with planning. The goal has nothing to do about the drive, the journey. They don't like the drive and the journey. They are interested in one thing and one thing only, the beach. And that's all they care about. And they can't wait to get to that goal. They can't wait to get to that destination. When Moses sets out for the promised land with the nation of Israel behind him, he has a goal in mind. He has a fierce focus in his head. He's going to get these people to the promised land. And even if it takes him 40 years, can you imagine how many times Moses was asked, are we there yet? Even if it takes him 40 years, he's going to make it. He's going to get there. What goals do you have? What things in your life are you fiercely focused on? Maybe you have a personal goal. You want to be a better husband or wife or grandparent or aunt or uncle or husband or wife, whatever. Maybe you have a professional goal. I want to develop some product that'll make a dent in my industry and will change the course of my company. What goals do you have in your life? One of the really important things about goals is that whatever your goals are, you choose them wisely, right? Because if we're not careful, we can get caught up in all sorts of, honestly, selfish and kind of silly goals. We can get caught up in goals that are in this life that will not last beyond this life. But we need to be careful with that because honestly, the goals that we choose and the goals that we achieve, ultimately those goals turn into the legacy that we leave. Those goals turn into what people remember about us. And so we got to choose those goals wisely. Because here's the problem if we don't. There's this old hymn. I love this hymn. It's written by an old Methodist guy. And it's called, "In the Cross of Christ I Glory." And the first two lines go like this. "In the cross of Christ I glory, towering over the wrecks of time." And I love that second line. Because that's what happens to every goal that is foolish and selfish and silly. With enough time, it just becomes a wreck. Because it's a goal that may be in this life, but it's not going to last beyond this life. I don't care how much money you make. I don't care how successful you become. I don't care how long your Wikipedia page entry is. I don't care if you build yourself a building and you emblazon your name across the side of it. If it is selfish, if it is silly, if it is focused only on this life, it's not going to last. In fact, if you go to ancient Greece or ancient Rome, and you go and see all those real old buildings, those are monuments to human ingenuity and Western culture. They're thousands of years old. And what do we call those real old buildings again? Ruins. Ruins. Because that's what happens to every selfish and silly and self-interested goal. Just give it enough time, and it'll just turn into a ruin. And so I'll make an assumption here, and the assumption is that we all have like bigger goals than just goals that last in this life, right? We all have goals that are meant to go beyond this life, turn into legacies that we want to leave. But even if we have the right goals, we still have a problem, and the problem is this. Have you ever noticed that life has a really funny way of distracting you from your goals? Do you struggle with this? I do. Best way I know how to describe it is kind of like this. When I hop into my truck, a lot of times I'll pull my phone out of my pocket and stick it in the center console, and that's really convenient because it's right there if I need it. It's also kind of a dumb move on my part, and here's the reason why. Inevitably, I'll be driving down the road and my phone will buzz. And I can be like fiercely focused on the road, right? My goal is to get from point A to point B safely. But as soon as my phone buzzes, what do you think I really want to do, right? I want to look at my phone. It's right there in my console. I'm thinking, well, maybe I got a text. Maybe the text is important. Maybe something is wrong. But if I take my eyes off the road, then something could really go wrong when I don't see the car in front of me, and all of a sudden, I crash. Life has a funny way of buzzing you, of sending you text messages. And as you're driving down the road of life, the temptation every single time is to look and to check. But when you do, you might just crash. Maybe you have a goal of getting healthy, losing weight, getting in shape, and that's kind of a legacy you actually want to leave, because maybe health is something your whole family has struggled with, and you want to do things differently, not just for you, but for your family. And so you're fiercely focused on your goal, and then you see the bag of potato chips, and it's over there buzzing, and you go, right? You get distracted from that goal. Maybe you have a goal of being financially secure. Your family for a long time has struggled with that. And it's not just for you, it's for like your kids, right? You want to save for their college funds, or you care about your spouse and y'all's retirement. But then you're looking around and you see that new toy, the toy that you've wanted for years or maybe even decades, the really expensive new toy that's like $10,000 or above, and it's like it's buzzing at you, right? And you want to go, oh, I want to buy that thing so bad. It distracts you. You need to know something. This happens to everybody. It even happened to Moses. Moses had this fierce focus, this goal of getting the nation of Israel to the promised land, and everything was going along great until about a year before Moses gets there. Because things started buzzing and Moses got distracted. The story happens in Numbers chapter 20. And in Numbers chapter 20, the nation of Israel is actually kind of in trouble. They're in the middle of the wilderness and they've gotten away from any water. Now, when you don't have any water in the wilderness and you're a couple million people strong, everybody gets dehydrated and everybody dies, and that's not good. And so they have a genuine problem. The problem with the problem is this. The Israelites, instead of trying to solve the problem, figure things out, they begin to accuse Moses of creating the problem. This is Numbers 20, verse 2. There was no water for the community, and the people, they all gathered in opposition to Moses. And they quarreled with Moses, and they said, hey, why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Now, notice, this is not just a question. This is an accusation. The people of Israel are saying to Moses, we know your game. We finally figured it out. You rescued us out of slavery. You led us across a wilderness because you ultimately wanted to kill us. You wanted us to get to the spot where we had no water in the middle of the wilderness, where we would all become dehydrated, where we would all die. You led us out here to murder us. Now put yourself in Moses' shoes for just a second, okay? If you had a bunch of people accusing you after 39 years of leading them through a wilderness of trying to murder them, how do you think you'd feel about that? Like, I'd be a little annoyed is a mild word for it, maybe? Angry is a more realistic word for it, maybe? But what Moses does in this moment is actually very noble. He goes to God, and he talks to God about their situation, and God talks to him. Verse 7 of Numbers 20, the Lord said to Moses, hey, you see this staff? Take this staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the whole assembly of Israel together. And then God says, I want you to speak to that rock. You see that rock over there? Go speak to that rock. And to pick up on those instructions, because they'll become important in just a second. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and the rock will turn into a fountain. It's going to pour out its water. So Moses and Aaron gather the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses says to them, listen, you rebels. And all of a sudden, you begin to see that Moses actually is angry, okay, at being accused of trying to murder the nation of Israel. He's saying, what are you guys doing? You're rebelling against God. You're rebelling against me. I don't like it. Listen, you rebels. Must we bring you water out of this rock? And so Moses raises his arm, and then look at what Moses does next. He doesn't follow directions. God has said to Moses, I want you to speak to the rock, but that's not what Moses does. Instead, Moses strikes the rock twice with his staff. Now, it's at this point in the story where everybody's kind of waiting around with bated breath. Because if you don't follow directions, you know what might happen? That rock might not turn into a fountain. Everything could go wrong, which means the Israelites aren't going to have any water in the wilderness, and they are going to dehydrate, and they are going to die. And so this is kind of a seminal moment. Everything is hanging on what's going to happen next with this rock. Very next line, water gushed out of the rock. And the community and the livestock of Israel drank, and everybody wipes the sweat off their brows and goes, okay, good. Moses didn't do such a good job at following directions, but everything's okay, except it's actually not okay. Because in the very next verse, God comes to Moses, taps him on the shoulder, and he says to him, you didn't trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites. And so you will not bring this community into the land that I give them. In other words, God says to Moses, you may have led the children of Israel to the promised land, but you're not going to lead them into the promised land. You're going to pass away before you're able to go in for a stay because you didn't follow my directions. Now, what happened here? Moses took his eyes off his goal. You see, he was so distracted by the grumbling and complaining of the Israelites. He was so distracted by his own frustration and annoyance and anger that he forgot what his fierce focus was supposed to be. He was supposed to focus on getting the children of Israel to the promised land. He was supposed to focus on the Lord, the God, who was leading them all to the promised land. But the Israelites were sending him all of these hateful text messages, complaining, and everything was buzzing, and he looks away, and what happens? He crashes. And the really sad thing about Moses is that it's not just a crash. It's a fatal crash. Back to Deuteronomy 34, Moses is up there on the top of this mountain, looking at this promised land. It's taken him 40 years to get the children of Israel to. And God says to Moses in verse 4, this is the land I promised, and I've let you see it with your own eyes, but you're not going to cross over into it. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. Moses, he didn't realize the full potential of his legacy because he lost his focus. He took his eyes off the goal. he messed up. But you know what? Moses isn't the only one who messes up. And that leads me to the one big question I think we all need to ask about all of our legacies and all of our goals, which is this: what happens when we mess up? And notice the question, it's not what happens if we mess up, because it's not a question of if. It's not. It's a question of when. You live long enough, you have enough goals, and eventually you're going to mess something up. No matter how noble your goals may be. You have that real noble goal of being a better husband, better wife, right? And then you get into a fight and all of a sudden you run away from each other rather than drawing close to each other, and you mess up. Or you're on that diet trying to get healthy and you see that bag of potato chips and you go for it and you mess up. You break your diet. Or you're trying to save and do better than maybe your family has ever done before for the future when it comes to your finances. And then something happens and your credit card bills get racked up and you mess up. What do we do when we mess up? In the time that we have remaining in this message, let me just give you two things to do. Two things to think through. And the first is this: when you mess up, don't give up on your legacy. When you mess up, don't give up on your legacy, because that's always the temptation, right? When we mess up, the temptation is to give up. Well, my marriage isn't going very well. Okay, sarah, I'm not even going to try anymore. Or, oh, I broke my diet and I ate that one potato chip. Might as well just down the whole bag. Or, oh, I'm kind of struggling financially. It's not even worth trying anymore. That's the temptation. Just to give up, but don't give up. You know, after Moses dies, we get this really kind of moving eulogy in Deuteronomy 34, verse 7. It says, Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength was gone. Now, I want you to notice how old Moses was when he died. He was 120 years old, and we look at that and we go, yeah, that's really, really old, right? But there's actually more to Moses' age than just his age. Maybe you've tried to read through the Bible before, and maybe you haven't been particularly successful. You know, you get through the first few chapters and you're going, I don't understand this, and I don't get this, and you get frustrated and you put it down. Well, number one, just let me encourage you to try again, because it's really a great read. But even if you only made it through the first few chapters of the Bible, you may have noticed something that maybe kind of puzzled you. Have you ever noticed that all the people in the first few chapters of the Bible lived a really long time? Like Adam and Eve, he lived 930 years before he died. Methuselah, who's the oldest guy in the Bible says he lived for 969 years before he died. And you think you have aches and pains. Imagine living 969 years, right? But what's kind of interesting about all these like massive lifespans is that you get to the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, and God shows up and he makes this pronouncement. In verse 3, he says, humans are mortal, and their days are going to be, now look at this, 120 years. Just like Moses. Now, this is not like a hard and fast cap on the upper end of a human lifespan. People after Genesis 6 in the Bible even live a little longer than like 120 years. But here's what this number becomes symbolic of in the Bible. It becomes symbolic of a full life. Even today, if you make it to 120 years, we're going to say you lived a real full life. Even after Moses' mess up in Numbers 20, he made it to 120 years old. He made it to a real full life. Because even after Moses' mess up in Numbers 20, he didn't give up. He didn't give up on his legacy. He kept leading the children of Israel to the precipice of the promised land. Can you imagine how disastrous it would have been if Moses gave up? If he would have said, well, you know what, I'm not going to make it in anyway, so you guys can just do whatever you want. Best of luck to you. We'd still have Israelites wandering around in the wilderness today, right? It would have been a disaster. But even after Moses messed up, he didn't give up. And my challenge to you is this: don't give up either. Because even when you feel like you've fallen down, really, you still have time. You're sitting here right now. You still have time to turn it around. And so don't give up on your legacy. That's the first thought on this question. Well, what happens if I mess up? Okay, second thought on this question, second thing to do and to think through when you mess up is this. I want you to remember this. Really remember this. God hasn't given up on you. Even when you mess up. God hasn't given up on you. Pop quiz, just to make sure you've been listening, okay? This is not a hard question, at least I don't think it is. So we've been reading through Deuteronomy 34, and Moses dies. Okay, he's right there on the edge of the promised land, and he passes away. So here's the question. Did Moses make it into the promised land? Just to make sure you've been listening and haven't fallen asleep, the answer is yes or no. No, he didn't make it into the promised land. Good job. Can you imagine how frustrating that must have been for Moses? I mean, really. All these years of serving God. All these years of leading kind of snotty Israelites through the wilderness, right? Who whine and complain and grumble and gripe. And he makes one stinking mistake. He doesn't quite follow directions, right? Because he gets a little upset. He strikes a rock when he should have spoken to a rock. I mean, really, who hasn't had a bad day like that? I mean, can you kind of feel for Moses here at least a little bit? I think I can. I mean, Moses had to be seriously frustrated. All these years of serving God, and one little mistake, and he gets locked out and left out of the promised land. You know, years ago when I was a freshman in college, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in Portland, and the way I got to Texas was actually because I went to college in Austin, Texas, at a small private university there. And when I first moved away from Portland down to Texas, I knew a total of one other person on the whole college campus. And I can remember it was kind of hard because like a lot of these guys who were in my college dorm especially, they had all grown up together. They had went to school together. They all knew each other. And so I was trying to like make my way into these friendship circles that were already formed. And I can remember one night specifically, shortly after I had gotten to college, and I heard these guys outside of my dorm room right there by a stairwell, and they were all huddled together in a circle having a conversation. They were going to go out to eat that night, and they wanted to go get some tacos. And so I kind of pop my head out the door and make my presence known, and they do see me, but they don't really acknowledge me. And as they're talking about tacos, I have this little thing that's going through my head, which is this. I like tacos. But they don't acknowledge me. They just keep talking. And they figure out where they're going to go to get tacos, and they figure out, who's going to drive, because not all of them had vehicles. It's college, only a few people have vehicles. And so they figure it all out, and then they start heading down the stairwell. Well, I'm still standing there in the doorway of my dorm. And although I wouldn't have ever admitted this at the time as an 18-year-old guy, my feelings were a little hurt. So I turn around and I go back into my dorm and I'm going, well, what am I going to eat? All I got is ramen, 15 cents a package. Don't like it? That's what I got. And so I'm getting ready to have a not-so-sumptuous feast, and all of a sudden I hear this voice, Zach! And I kind of do an about face, and I turn around and I come back to my doorway, and climbing up the stairwell is this guy named Mark. I still remember this all these years later, still remember his name. And he says to me, hey, Zach, you want to come with us? And although I wouldn't have ever admitted it at the time, his invitation meant the world to me. I mean, obviously it did. I'm talking about it 25 years later because I remember it, obviously. But here's the reason it made such a difference. When I first got to college, I knew basically nobody. And so I kind of felt like Moses, locked out and left out. Until somebody invited me in. Let me tell you another story. This one from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9. Jesus is going on a hiking trip, kind of like Moses, hiking up a mountain with some of his best friends, his closest disciples, Peter, James, and John. And the mountain that Jesus is hiking up, it's a mountain called Mount Tabor. In fact, I actually had the folks who were in Israel send us a picture. They snapped of Mount Tabor, here it is, while they were doing their tour of Israel. And just to kind of situate you again here, Mount Tabor is between Nazareth and the Sea of Galilee, and it's right smack dab in the middle of the Promised Land, where the Israelites were trying to get to for all those years. And so Jesus and his disciples, they're hiking up this mountain. This is Luke 9, verse 28. Jesus took Peter, James, and John. They're all huddled in the circle with him, and they hike up this mountain, and it's meant to be kind of a spiritual retreat. They're going up there to pray. But then in verse 29, something amazing happens. As Jesus is praying, the appearance of his face changes, and his clothes become as bright as a flash of lightning. Now, theologians will refer to this as the transfiguration, which basically means that Jesus' whole figure is changing. His face is changing, his clothes are changing, and the disciples are getting a glimpse of who Jesus really is. He's really God. But that's not the only miraculous, incredible thing that happens on Mount Tabor that day. With Jesus are two guys. This is verse 30. And I'll start with the second one first. He's Elijah. He's a prophet, a real famous prophet from the Old Testament. But who's the first guy? What's his name again? What's his name? Okay. Where's Moses again? Mount Tabor. Where's Mount Tabor again? Between Nazareth and the Sea of Galilee, right smack dab in the middle of the Promised Land. Let me ask you a question. Did Moses make it to the Promised Land? Did he? Yes. Yes. Now here's the even more important question. How? How did Moses make it? The answer is right here in the verse. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with, who's that? Jesus. Jesus. He's how Moses made it to the Promised Land. Because just when Moses was feeling locked out and left out, here comes Jesus, trudging up the stairwell of a mountain, saying to Moses, hey, you can come too. You see, in spite of the fact that Moses lost his focus, in spite of the fact that Moses broke a bit of his legacy, in spite of the fact that Moses fell into sin, Jesus still invited him in. Because God had not given up on Moses. God hasn't given up on you either. And so if you've blown a goal, or if you feel like you're struggling with your legacy, Maybe you do feel locked out and left out of something that you really want to do. It's a goal that you can't reach, a legacy that you can't seem to achieve, a dream that you can't seem to bring into reality, a hope that you can't quite seem to feel. No matter what it is that you're trying to do with your life, when you break your legacy, when you fall short of your goals, and when you fall into sin, Jesus comes trudging up the stairwell of your life because he wants to invite you in. You see, Moses is not the reason that Moses left such a fantastic legacy. Jesus is the reason that Moses left such a fantastic legacy. You will not be the reason that you leave a fantastic legacy. But with Jesus, even when you fall into sin, he invites you in, and he can shape you into the person that he wants, and he can give you a legacy that lasts. So, aim for that. Aim for him. Let's stand and pray. Heavenly Father, we try and toil, and we still mess things up, and we don't always achieve or accomplish our goals. So thanks for Jesus. And thanks that even when we feel locked out and left out of maybe our own dreams, you work in us and through us, and you send Jesus for us. Thanks for inviting us in by him and through him. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen. Now, as you leave this place, remember, it's because of Jesus that you'll leave a legacy. And it's because of Jesus that you're blessed. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you his peace. And now go. Go and shine like stars in the universe as you hold out God's precious word of life. Amen.